Good morning. I'm Ellen Horstman with First United Methodist Church in Camden, Arkansas. So I want you to go on a little imaginative journey with me for a minute. So imagine that there's a young man from the country with only a limited education and very limited worldly experience, and he begins to preach, and he's so charismatic that he begins to draw all this attention to himself. And pretty soon people are posting about him on Facebook, people are putting out tweets, people are making videos and putting them on TikTok. The whole world, as it seems, is all abuzz with this guy, and everybody wants to meet him. Everybody wants to see what he has to say. And so it turns out that he's coming to town. He's coming to a town near you. And so the local United Methodist women decide, we're going to have a banquet and we're going to have this guy come. Well, pretty soon they invite the county judge, they invite the mayor, and everybody who's anybody starts trying to get an invitation to this banquet for this young man. And as he is handling, the young man passes a streetwalker and invites her to come with him. He sees a panhandler and he invites him in with him. And so here he comes in with this guy and another and maybe some more ragtag people, the streetwalker and the panhandler and so forth. And everyone's kind of looking around thinking, what's he doing with these people? Well, meantime, you've got all these folks that are trying to make sure they're the person sitting at the head table. And this young preacher watches them for a while. And instead of being gracious to them, instead of saying, hey, I really appreciate this honor, he starts fussing at sort of the head honchos and says, why are you fighting each other for position at the table? And why did you, he says to the UMW president, why did you invite all these hoity-toity people? You should have been out here inviting this streetwalker. You should have been inviting this panhandler. You should have been going out to the projects. You should have been going out among the immigrants, both legal and illegal. You should have been inviting those people here. Well, you can imagine what a sensation that would make and how affronted some church people would be. And if we go with that, we can't even begin to get at how the people who first heard this parable of Jesus that I'm going to read to you now from let me think for a minute, the 14th chapter of Luke, how they would have felt. Because Jesus kind of turns things upside down. So I'm going to Luke chapter 14, and I'm going to begin with verse 7. When Jesus noticed, I should back up a little bit. I didn't read all the verses that are the prelude to this, the first 6 verses of the chapter. We're told that it was a Sabbath day, and Jesus was invited to be at table in a Pharisee's house. And when he gets there, they're all watching him to see what he does. It turns out he cures somebody, and it happens to be a Sabbath. And so the Pharisees, the church leaders, why don't we modernize that? The church leaders, the UMW president, the administrative council president, and so forth, they're tisk-tisking this idea that he would treat somebody or heal somebody on the Sabbath. And then Jesus begins to observe how they're fighting each other for position at the table. So before I even read that, let me just say that at a banquet or a feast in that day, the tables were usually in kind of a U shape, a squared off U, of course. And at the table that was at the base, that was where the guest of honor would be placed. And that was the most prestigious place to be, in that center of that center table. And then the next most prestigious place would be on the immediate right of the honored guest, and then the next on the immediate left, and then so forth as it went on down the table. And so Jesus begins to watch people trying to get into position in the most honored places. And so here's what Luke says. I'm finally going to read this. When Jesus noticed how the guests sought out the best seats at the table, he told them a parable. When someone invites you to a wedding celebration, don't take your seat in the place of honor. Someone more highly regarded than you could have been invited by your host. The host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give your seat to the other person. Embarrassed, you will take your seat in the least important place. Instead, when you receive an invitation, go and sit in the least important place. And when your host approaches you, he will say, now friend, move up here to a better seat. Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. For all who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. And then Jesus said to the person who had invited him, when you host a lunch or a dinner, don't invite your friends or your brothers or your sisters or your relatives or your rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you in return, and that will be your reward. Instead, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they can't repay you. Instead, you will be repaid when the just are resurrected. As I said, this would have been a shocking thing to them. Well, I think it would be to us. If somebody invited a guest to dinner, no matter how abuzz the world is about that guest, and then he fussed at the inviter for who had been invited and said, don't invite the high society people or don't invite the church leaders, but instead, why don't you invite these down and outs that nobody ever thinks of, and some of whom we would definitely even want to look down on. Wow. That is an uncomfortable thing. So what is going on here? I mean, it almost sounds like a Dear Abby column here at one point, because Jesus seems to be giving some practical advice. He says, well, if you come in, don't pick the most important place. Don't go sit in the most honored seat or one of the most honored seats, because if you do, it's possible that someone else has been invited that the host wants to put there, and then you'll have the shame and embarrassment of having to move down to a lower place. So it sounds like some good social advice. I said Dear Abby or maybe Emily Post, I don't know, but it's a lot more than that. Now, Jesus partly is talking about how we as human beings just can't seem to stop jockeying for position or vying for position, kind of getting our place in the pecking order. One of the things that I enjoyed about teaching, I had taught high school for 19 years before I became a librarian, and as a librarian I had kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, which gave me a wonderful chance to watch elementary kids. To me, they're a lot like we are. It's just that they're more obvious about it. And so I could see that jockeying for position among the kindergartners and the first graders. Anyone who's ever taught at that level knows that when it comes time to line up for anything, kids will fight each other to be the first one in line. They'll take that arm, and they'll push someone out of the way, and they'll holler to the teacher, she's getting in front of me. And so most teachers, to solve that and to keep that particular dispute out of the way, they'll have a leader for the day. And they have a little rotation system. And by jingo, you better not be the first person in line if you're not the leader, because the leader will let the teachers know who the leader is. So as a librarian, I would get these kids coming from a classroom, and sometimes the first thing they'd tell me when they came in is, I'm the leader, because they wanted to be the leader. Didn't even matter, you could be all lining up to go get a paddling. Not that that really happened, but my point was, they always wanted to be the leader. And we're really not that different. We worry about our status, and we push and strive to get somewhere in that pecking order. I think sometimes we like to think, oh, no, I don't care what anybody thinks about me. I used to believe that about myself, that I didn't care what anyone thought about me. In a general sense, that might be true. I might not care what many people think about me, but I do care what those whom I respect and those whom I love, those whom I feel close to, I probably care what they think about me. It's a little hard to keep from that. And so we worry about our status, and we have this tendency to want to be more highly placed and more highly thought of, maybe sometimes, than we should be. That's what was happening here when people were vying for a place at the table. And I couldn't help but read this and think kind of a different thing, maybe not quite as important what our place is at the table, but I'm thinking about going to some banquets. We used to have banquets at annual conference for the local pastors. There was a little rural pastors organization or something. I don't remember what it was called, but My husband and I would go to this all the time, and they would always invite the bishop and the district superintendents to come to this banquet. Not all of them could come, but some would. And of course, you had the speaker, whoever was doing the presenting and the speaking, but then the other places at the head table were reserved for the district superintendents. And more than once, we would go to this thing, and here's a place set here. We had a district superintendent in the, it was the Little Rock annual conference at that time, but this man had gone on to be an official at the national level on the General Board of Missions, or the Board of Global Ministries, I'll get that right, eventually chairing a committee on religion and race, which was a very prestigious position that he had held. And then he came back and was a district superintendent. But at some point, and I don't remember now whether it was on the global board or whether he was a district superintendent the first time I saw him doing this, but here was a place reserved for him because he had indicated he was going to come, but he wasn't sitting in it. And people began to wonder, well, where is he? Did he not come? He said he was going to come. Oh, he was there. Turned out he'd gone back to the kitchen to see if they needed any help. Turned out that when the meals were being brought out and when the tea and the water and so forth was being distributed, there he was, bringing food to people's table, bringing them tea, and continuing throughout the whole banquet to come and see that somebody's glass needed to be filled and so forth. I've never forgotten that example of humility. He didn't do that for attention, and he didn't take his honored place. He saw that there was a need, and he attended to it. And that, I think, is what Jesus is suggesting to us that we need to do, to stop worrying about status. Jesus is telling us that where we fit in the pecking order is not important, that we need to be freed from the burden of worrying about what other people say about us. We need to be freed from that burden. Now, I'm going to tell you, I don't think we can just free ourselves. We need a lot of help from Jesus, and we need to put things in perspective. We have a tendency to act as if we deserve what we get, and a tendency to forget the gifts that we have been given. When we can remember how we've been blessed and we can remember what God has given us, it becomes a little bit easier to stop trying to put ourselves up in a high status. But Jesus fusses at us, as he does all the time here in this little situation, this parable. He reminds us that all people are equal in God's eyes, that there is no status that makes us a better Christian or a better person. In fact, Jesus tells us that God has a special compassion for the people we would consider the down and outs or the derelicts, or the sort of the no-gooders in society. And so he tells us we should go and invite those down and outs to the meal. Imagine what it would be like if we could live out that vision of Jesus Christ. Imagine what it would be like if we could live free from the encumbrance of worrying about what other people think about us, or what our status is, or where we fit at the table, so to speak. Reverend David Luce, the Lutheran seminary professor, says that in this parable, Jesus, I'm going to grab my glasses here and read what he says. Jesus invites us to live into the freedom to stop calculating our social prestige and stop worrying about what other people think about us, and simply to be kind to everyone around us, particularly those who are most often not recipients of kindness. He invites us to experience the joy of playing God's helper, of handing out the abundant gifts of dignity and worth and value with which we have been blessed. So he said we get to be God's helper in the same way that sometimes the kid under the Christmas tree gets to be Santa's helper. And stop worrying about status and just reach out with abundant love to those around us and experience that joy. And he says particularly to those who very seldom receive it. You know, one of the things I've had the opportunity and the joy to learn is how much people respond to the simplest kindness. Working in the food pantry, it just comes natural to most of us who work there that when someone comes in, you greet them with a smile. My goodness, my mother taught me to be polite to all people. But it is amazing to me sometimes when a person comes in, and especially if they've never been to us before, or now they drive up, they don't come in because of the pandemic. But when we treat them with respect and we treat them as if they are equal to us, which they are, but we treat them with dignity. You can see people whose shoulders are drooping just lift back up. You can see people who come in with their eyes cast down on the ground, looking up and realizing that they are being valued as human beings, and some of them are so hungry for that because they are so accustomed to being treated with indignity. Unfortunately, we do that. When we meet people who are poor, we have a tendency to kind of look down on them and wonder what they're doing wrong that they're in that status. I can remember kind of another simple example of just extending human kindness. When I was a college student one summer, I worked as a nursing assistant in a nursing home, and I got put down on the wing that had the people that were most suffering with dementia or were not ambulatory. But I can remember in particular one day that a woman was talking to me, and she was bedridden, and I don't know why, but on an impulse I just reached out and hugged her. Now, this woman never had any visitors. I don't know if she had any family in the area or not, but nobody ever came to see her. And I just reached out and gave her a hug. And I mean, she latched onto me and she held on so tight and didn't let go. And that's when I realized how important human touch was. And that woman had been in the nursing home alone for about 3 or 4 years at that point. And I wondered if anybody had ever hugged her. Just like another time, this put me in mind of that I gave a ride home to a woman who had come into the food pantry. She was kind of crazy and, looked kind of sideways out of her eyes and hollered stuff out because I think she thought people were talking to her. And so we were all a little bit afraid of her, but certainly we were distant from her. But I gave her a ride home. She lived out in the country. And before I got ready to go, she said, "Oh, honey, I wish you'd give me a hug." So I did. And she held on and held on and held on. There are people all around us who long for human touch or long for someone to just look them in the eye and treat them with the dignity that all people deserve. And Jesus is inviting us here to let go of our desire to be somewhere in a pecking order and to just grab onto the opportunity and the joy of serving other people with love and treating them with dignity. It's so ironic because when we do that, we find we actually feel better and we get much less concerned about where we fit. So this is about watching out for that pecking order. And I'm going to go another step and say the Pharisees here weren't just thinking about the day-to-day pecking order, but they were thinking about, I'm going to call it the ultimate pecking order, because it's very obvious that they get the allusion Jesus is making here. When Jesus talks about the banquet or coming to a banquet, he is also referring to the Pharisees' idea that they were going to be first, that they were going to be the honored guest, as it were, in God's heavenly banquet. And that becomes very obvious. I didn't read this part of it, and I shouldn't have put my glasses off, but let me find it. But it becomes very obvious that they sort of have that idea in mind, because after Jesus speaks to them, one of the dinner guests, hearing Jesus' remarks, as I'm reading verse 15, says to Jesus, "Happy are those who will feast in God's kingdom." So it turns out that these Pharisees, these church people, as it were, who are attending this banquet with Jesus, they have a pretty good idea that they are going to be sort of the first people. They're going to be the honored guest in God's heavenly banquet, in God's kingdom. And that's another thing we as Christians have to guard against. We have a tendency sometimes not just to entrust that God loves us, but we have a tendency to start thinking that we deserve God's love, that we deserve to be sort of first in the kingdom. We think that we deserve God's attention because we've been good. We've followed the rules in the holy book. And I don't know that we always consciously tell ourselves that, but I think we have that in the back of the mind. I'm thinking right now of one time when I was a young whippersnapper teaching an adult class in a small church that was multi-generational, and there were people who were, at that time, old enough to be my grandmother. So here I am thinking I'm going to teach them. But I remember one day saying that I didn't think there was really any such thing as a little sin. And my point was that sin separates us from God. But I can remember a woman who was probably about as old as I am now. She really took affront at that. And she told me, look, I don't think the things I do are anything like, somebody that commits a murder or someone who, she said, I remember my aunt who was so cruel to her children. Well, no, I mean, you probably haven't done something as reprehensible as committing a murder. But the point is that if you're a sinner, you're a sinner. If you're a sinner, you're not doing the will of God. And if you're a sinner, you're doing things that separate you from God's love, not because God wants to leave, but because you're leaving God, and that separates you from loving God's people because you're thinking about yourself. So in that sense, there's no such thing as a small sin. But there's that tendency we have to think that we sort of deserve God's attention because, I've always done everything, God, that you asked me to do. That's the reason sometimes when bad things happen, things go wrong, you'll hear Christians puzzling. Why is this happening? I've always done I always have done what I thought God wanted me to do. It's because sometimes we forget that it's not what we do, it's what God does. We have received the gift of God's grace, and we don't deserve it. Nothing. And maybe that's what part of our problem is. I'm talking about pecking order. We want to compare ourselves to other people. But what if we compared ourselves to Jesus? I think we'd pretty well figure out, okay, we don't deserve God's love. I don't deserve God's love, and yet God loves me anyway. I don't need to live as if everything I have belongs to me, as if everything I have I deserve. And we do that sometimes. We tend to live like, I deserve everything I have, including my righteousness. No, I need to remember that these are all gifts from God. And Jesus reminds us here in this passage that none of us really merit God's love. And we don't have to, thank goodness. God gives it to us freely. God showers it upon us. But Jesus, in all of his life and all of his ministry, was reminding us that as God has showered God's love upon us and God has given us freely, we are to give to others. So he tells the people that are listening there, don't invite people who can reciprocate. Go out and invite the lame and the blind and the crippled. I mean, that would be like me telling you, go out and invite the streetwalkers. Go out and invite the winos. Go out and invite those illegal immigrants and have them come to your table. Don't worry about the people that can pay you back. What? Jesus is reminding us that we are to reach out to everyone and to love everyone, but he especially has a passion for those who feel they are not loved, for those who are down and out, for those who literally are more in need of love and reassurance than anyone else. And so he invites us into that kingdom work, and he lets us know that it begins right now. We don't have to wait till the heavenly happy ever after to start living in God's kingdom. We do it now when we reach out. We do it now when we get away from the head table, when we pull away from trying to get our place at the head table and go out looking for the blind and the lame and the disabled. Again, for the down and outs in our society. And the irony of it is, that's a scary idea, to go out there and mix and mingle, to go out there finding people that are in need and taking care of them and socializing with them, sitting at table with them. That's a scary idea. And we're not really sure we can do it. We're not really sure we want to do it. But the irony of it is that when we do it, we sometimes find that that the tables are reversed, that we think that we should be at the head of the table, that we're the good people or we're the ones that are going to help someone, and we find out that it's different than that. I'm going to read you a little excerpt from, we put together a book for Ozark Mission Project at our 25th anniversary and invited people to write about their experiences. And one young man named Scott, well, he was 30-ish or so at the time he wrote this, but here's what he said about his experience when he decided for the first time to go out into mission work, to go out and try to live out the gospel of helping people in need. He said, I had it all figured out in my head that I would be helping individuals or families, and that was the main purpose of the trip. So I'm going to stop for a minute. Scott said, man, I had it all figured out. I was going to go help other people. That was the main purpose of my trip. And back to what he says, little did I know that God had a huge surprise in store for me. As I met and spent time with my neighbors, I immediately realized the power of God through other people. I had always been a believer, but it was at my first OMP mission where I accepted Christ with my whole heart and realized how important a daily relationship with Him is. Without interacting with my neighbors, I'm not sure where my walk would be today. Do you hear that? Scott went on a mission trip. Man, you should really get brownie points for that. He went on a mission trip thinking that he was going to go help other people. And he found out the very people that he had been sent to serve were lifting him up and teaching him how to have a real and lasting relationship with Jesus Christ. We need to pull away from that table. We find that our lives are enriched when we do so. I'm seeing that my time's running out on me, but I want to tell you another short little story, and I'll shorten it up. I had two girls at a Ozark Mission Project camp when I was a driver. And one was a hard worker, and her name was Christy, and the other one was not a hard worker. Her name was Kristen. So we have a Christy and a Kristen. And on the last day of work, when we were in a home, we'd been there the day before, Kristen announced that she wasn't going to work in there. She didn't have to. She was a volunteer. The work was too hard, and she wasn't going to do it. And she spent all day long outside in the van sleeping or texting on her phone. Christy worked and worked and worked. Well, we were serving an old man. He was in his 90s, and he didn't smell very good. You know, he didn't know, his house wasn't very clean, and he wasn't very clean. And he didn't interact with us very much. He didn't want to eat with us. He didn't want to sit in the same room and talk. But I did kind of figure out after a while that he was listening to us, because when we would be picking at each other, I could hear him in the other room laughing. So we got ready to leave after having spent 2 days there. And all of a sudden, we were telling this older man that we were leaving, and all of a sudden he just burst into tears, which shocked us. But he told me, or not me, he told us, I just don't want you to leave. I don't want you to leave. He said, nobody has ever been this good to me. Nobody's ever been this kind to me. I want you to give me something to remember you by, something with your name on it. Well, we kind of pondered for a minute, what were we going to give this guy? And we were in West Memphis at the time. The police there had asked us to put a little sign on our cars so that they would know we were Ozark Mission Project. So we literally had an 8.5 by 10 piece of paper with, that somebody had taken a magic marker and written Ozark Mission Project on. So we took that out of the window of my car, and we all signed our names on it and put a little message on it, And then he asked us to hang it up in a prominent place on his porch, his little screened-in porch, and where people would see it before they walked into the door of his house, because he wanted people to know how kind these folks had been to him. And he'd never had anybody in all his life, and folks, this guy was in his 90s, he'd never had anybody that was that kind to him. And of course, he made us all cry. And when we got ready to go, we all gave him a big old hug and took his hand and prayed with him. And we got out to the car. And Kristen, who had not joined us the whole time, we invited her, but she didn't come. As we were driving back to camp, she looked at Christy, and Kristen kind of shuddered a little bit, and she said, "Oh, I just don't know how you did it." And Christy said, "What?" "I don't know how you hugged that nasty, smelly, dirty old man." And Christy just said, "Oh, Kristen, I'm so sorry. You don't know what you missed." No, she didn't know what she missed, but we are like Kristen more than we care to admit. Jesus invites you to go out, to find your way among his people, to love them and to serve them, to remember that you do not deserve his love, and to take the wonderful love and the grace that he has given you. I don't know where that will be, but I guarantee you that if you will stay in prayer this week, and if you will open your eyes and your ears and listen with your whole heart, if you will ask God to give you the wisdom to see those in need and the courage to act, he will take you to a joy that is beyond all comprehension when he allows you the privilege of inviting to his table those who are the lost and the least and the most needy. I pray that this will be your week for you. May God bless you all now and always. Amen and goodbye.